At Youngstown, Ohio, February of 1933. 3 coins touched the wooden tabletop with a brief sound, and then lay still beside a coal bill folded into quarters. Outside the window, old snow had turned gray along the road leading toward the steel mills. Inside the kitchen, steam fogged the small glass pane in the oven door. The enamel pot still hung from its wall hook. The wife of a steelworker set her cloth purse on the table, checked inside it with her fingertips, and then folded it closed. Nothing else was taken out. Near the door, one child bent down to retie a worn shoelace. The younger child stood beside the stove and looked toward the refrigerator. The mother opened the door. A bowl of cold rice sat beneath a small enamel plate. Nearby were half a bottle of milk, a bag of raisins, several graham crackers, and a jar of molasses with residue still clinging around the rim, the tin box, 3 coins, and the kitchen light still on the high shelf. The tin recipe box sat slightly crooked because one of its feet had long ago bent out of shape. The mother reached up and took it down. The lid opened with a small snap. A coin caught in one corner rolled gently to the side. Inside were cards softened along the edges. One card contained only 3 words: rice, milk, sugar. Another read, cornmeal left to cool overnight, no temperature, no cooking time. No indication of how large the pot should be. The missing instructions had been remembered more by hand than by eye. One corner of a card carried an old brown stain where molasses had once touched it. The back remained only a faint pencil note. Do not throw away what is left. 10 minutes was not always a short amount of time. In a kitchen that knew what to do, 10 minutes could become a supper. The cards beneath revealed other traces. A bowl of cold rice was never discarded. A metal lunch pail was wrapped in 2 layers of wax paper before dawn in Detroit. A portion of potatoes left from the previous evening appeared on the breakfast table in a different form. A slice of bread was cut into a circle using the rim of a drinking cup. A final piece of sausage was chopped into small bits to stretch across several corn cakes. And somewhere near the bottom of the stack was a recipe that hardly needed to be written down at all. All it required was a skillet hot enough, and someone who knew which portion had to be saved for tomorrow. The mother placed the first card beside the 3 coins. On it were only 3 pencil lines: cold rice, milk, little raisins. The enamel pot was lifted from its hook and set onto the stove. Tonight, the recipe box opens from the winter of 1933. The first dish begins with a bowl of rice that no one in that house would allow themselves to throw away. 1 enamel pot and 5 dishes in the winter of 1930. 3 Youngstown, Ohio, February of 1933. Some weeks the steelworker worked every shift. Other weeks he returned home before noon with gloves that were still clean. In the house near the mill district, his wife never knew how thick the weekend pay envelope would be. She only knew there was rice, cornmeal, milk, crackers, molasses, and a can of fat beside the stove. The next 5 dishes passed through the same family, the same winter, and the same chipped enamel pot. Even a small pot could warm a room. Dish number 30 was rice and raisin pudding. About 9 cents made 4 small bowls. The wooden spoon broke apart the cold rice before the milk was poured in. The raisins floated upward as the pot began to steam. The older child placed 4 bowls on the table, one of them with a crack running nearly to the bottom. The thicker portion was reserved for the father, who had just walked home from the mill gate. The mother scraped the final spoonful of rice into her own bowl. Last night's rice had found a second evening. Dish number 29 was graham cracker porridge, about 8 cents for 3 bowls. The crackers crumbled beneath the palm of a hand and then softened in the hot milk. One child wrapped a wool scarf around the neck, held the bowl with both hands, and let the steam touch the face. The mother tested the temperature with the back of the spoon. The dry crackers softened before the household went to sleep. Dish number 28 was fried cornmeal mush. About 11 cents was enough to divide into 4 portions. The cornmeal mush left overnight was cut into slices and placed into hot fat. The mother waited until the edges were dry and the underside released itself from the skillet. The children took the crisp outer pieces. She accepted the final slice, the one that had broken apart. The secret was knowing when to leave it alone. Dish number 27 was oyster cracker soup, about 10 cents for 3 bowls. The father returned late, leaving melted snow across the floor. The broth was reheated, and the small crackers floated before sinking. A bowl that had already been placed upside down was turned over and set before him. The hot bowl arrived before any questions. Dish number 26 was molasses fried apples. Bruised apples were trimmed, sliced thin, and pan-fried with 1 spoonful of molasses. The scent of dark sugar spread through the kitchen while snow still lay outside the door. The younger child scraped the remaining molasses from the edge of the plate. A bruised apple still made the kitchen smell like autumn. 5 dishes had passed through the same enamel pot, skillet, and can of fat. In Youngstown, the kitchen kept warm those who remained at home. But in Detroit in 1943, the food had to leave the kitchen, travel in a metal lunch pail, and accompany a worker through a long shift. Wax paper, bread, and the lunch pail pacing through the factory gate, Detroit, Michigan, 1943. Before dawn, a metal latch on a lunch pail snapped open in the kitchen of a wartime factory worker. One corner of the pail was dented, and the handle had been wrapped with cord because the old plastic covering had cracked. On the table were white bread, an onion, a few eggs, a jar of jam, a can of fish, and a small portion of meat from the previous evening's supper. Mother worked beneath the kitchen light while her husband buttoned his coat, and the 2 children remained in the next room. The lunch pail did not need to be full. It needed to be enough to carry its owner through an entire shift. Dish number 25 was a sardine and onion sandwich. About 12 cents made 1 large sandwich. A small metal key rolled the lid of the sardine can into a narrow strip. She let some of the oil drain onto a plate, spread the fish onto the bread, and added a few very thin onion slices. The sandwich was pressed lightly, wrapped in 2 layers of wax paper, and placed into the pail. By break time, the smell of fish mixed with the scent of hard-boiled eggs and cold sausage in the room behind the factory floor. The wax paper protected the sandwich. The sandwich carried the worker through the rest of the shift. Dish number 24 was jam bread roll-ups, about 6 cents for 3 small rolls. The rim of a glass flattened the soft center of the bread. The crusts were saved for the evening soup pot. Jam was spread thinly and rolled tightly to fit inside the child's lunch compartment. On the back of a bill stored in the recipe box was a single note: "Save the crusts." 1 slice of bread was divided into 3 parts to fit 3 bites. Dish number 23 was egg in a hole, about 13 cents for 1 serving. The rim of a glass cut a circle from the center of a bread slice. An egg was cracked into the opening, while the round piece of bread rested beside the skillet to absorb the remaining grease. The child ate the round piece before running out the door. The space in the center of a slice of bread held an entire egg. Dish number 22 was soy sauce egg rice, about 14 cents for 1 large serving. Cold rice was loosened beneath the edge of a metal spoon. The egg was scrambled in the center of the skillet, and only then was the rice drawn in. Soy sauce touched the hot surface of the skillet before coating each grain. The egg did not sit on top of the rice. It became part of every spoonful. Dish number 21 was chopped beef and onion sandwich spread. About 31 cents was enough to make 3 sandwiches. Leftover beef was chopped finely and mixed with onions and a little sauce. The mother spread the filling onto all 3 slices before returning to divide what remained in the bowl. She divided the meat before folding a single sandwich closed. At the end of the day, the lunch pail returned with crumpled wax paper, a few breadcrumbs, and the smell of cold metal. In the cupboard, there were still potatoes, rice, and a little meat. The following evening, they would not return in the same form. The plate covering the bulwal, and yesterday, food taking on a new job, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, 1949. The kitchen of a steelworker's family A small enamel plate was lifted from the top of a bowl of cold potatoes. A bowl of rice sat behind it, while a portion of roast meat was wrapped in paper, darkened with grease at one corner. The mother opened the recipe box for the second time. Between the cards was a folded store receipt, and on the back was a pencil note. Do not simply reheat it. She placed the paper beside the cutting board. What remained from yesterday would not return in the same form. Dish number 20 was potato and egg hash. About 17 cents was enough for 2 large portions. Cubes of boiled potatoes fell into a thin layer of fat and then remained undisturbed until the edges turned brown. Mother created 2 openings in the skillet and cracked an egg into each one. The fully cooked egg was removed first for the younger child. The soft-yolked egg remained a little longer for the father. Yesterday's potatoes needed only one brown side to become a different breakfast. Dish number 19 was leftover meat and vegetable fried rice, about 26 cents for 3 portions. Leftover meat was cut into pieces smaller than the bowl of a spoon. Onions and carrots softened before the cold rice was drawn into the skillet. The egg was beaten in the open space at the center. The meat went in last, but heated just enough without drying further. As the spoon moved through the pan, every portion of rice could touch a piece of meat. The meat was cut small so it could stretch farther through the skillet. Dish number 18 was open-faced roast beef sandwich with gravy. About 38 cents made 3 portions. The roast beef was divided over slices of bread, while the congealed gravy was smoothed out again with a little water. Mother called everyone to the table before tilting the spoon. The sound of feet running through the hallway, wooden chairs being pulled close to the table, and only then did the hot gravy touch the center of the bread. She called everyone before the gravy touched the bread. Dish number 17 was quick macaroni and stewed tomatoes, about 23 cents for 4 small bowls. Tender macaroni was mixed with stewed tomatoes and a piece of butter. The father's portion remained in the pot beneath a lid set slightly askew so steam could escape. The 3 ingredients could still wait for someone to come home. Dish number 16 was quick cream of tomato soup. About 19 cents was enough for 3 bowls. Milk gradually lightened the color of the tomatoes, and old bread was toasted crisp in a skillet. The older child broke pieces of bread into the soup, while the father dipped only the corners. The mother placed the plate of toast in the center of the table and left it there. With the same bowl of soup, each person softened the bread differently. At the end of the day, the old bowls were empty, and the plates used as lids had returned to the shelf. The recipe box closed with one corner of the receipt still visible, but in St. Louis in 1954, the morning would begin almost from nothing. 1 egg, 1 slice of bread, and a skillet still cold. The sound of the coffee pot, coat buttons, and 5 breakfasts before 7 o'clock St. Louis, Missouri, 1954. Before the clock hand had even reached 6 o'clock, the coffee pot had already begun making a soft simmering sound on the stove. The wife of a morning shift worker placed a skillet over the flame, while one child searched for a glove beneath a chair and the other fastened a coat button into the wrong buttonhole. On the table were eggs, bread, rice, milk, cottage cheese, and pancakes left from the previous evening. The refrigerator door opened and closed. A wooden chair slid away from the table. Her husband had to leave the house before 7 o'clock. Its morning did not leave many spare minutes, but she knew exactly what needed to touch the skillet first. Dish number 15 was egg in a hole, about 13 cents for 1 serving. The brim of a drinking glass cut a circle from the center of a bread slice, while butter melted around the edge of the skillet. The egg was cracked into the opening, and the round piece of bread was toasted beside it. Mother told the older child to remain seated until the yolk stopped running. Breakfast took less time than washing egg from a shirt cuff. Dish number 14 was poached egg over buttered rice, about 18 cents. The egg slipped from a small cup into gently simmering water and was then placed on hot buttered rice. That bowl usually went to someone recovering from a fever or to the father returning from a night shift. She watched the way he wrapped his hands around the coffee cup before removing the bowl from the stove. Some mornings, a person's posture said everything that needed to be said. Dish number 13 was cottage cheese pancakes. About 27 cents made 6 small pancakes. The white curds of cottage cheese were still visible in the batter as each round was poured onto the skillet. The younger child crawled beneath the table, searching for the missing glove. The children chose the more perfectly round pancakes. The misshapen one was placed on the mother's plate. On the edge of the table, the back of an old recipe card carried a milk shopping list written in pencil. The crooked pancake still rose from the skillet with the same steam as all the others. Dish number 12 was bacon and egg cups, about 34 cents for 4 small cups. Bacon strips were curved around the molds, breadcrumbs rested at the bottom, and eggs were divided into the centers. Once the tray entered the oven, mother's hands moved on to the coffee pot, the lunch pail, tangled hair, and the sock lying behind a chair leg. The oven held the eggs while her hands handled everything else. Dish number 11 was reheated buttered pancakes. About 15 cents returned 4 cold pancakes to the skillet with a thin layer of butter. Syrup was poured into a small cup so the 2 children could divide it themselves. She flipped the next pancake before anyone mentioned how little remained in the bottle. The pancakes from the previous evening returned to the table with 2 warm sides and butter just beginning to melt around the edges. Before 7 o'clock, 5 breakfasts had left the skillet, the pot, and the baking molds. The sound of the coffee pot softened. The coat buttons were fastened correctly, the lunch pail was closed, and the missing glove rested beneath the edge of the table. But in Reading, Pennsylvania, in 1956, the evening would begin with a different sound. Onions touching hot fat and the first piece of meat meeting a cast iron surface. The day there was meat in the skist, and the smell of onions reached the pork Reading, Pennsylvania, on a weeknight in 1956. The pay envelope was passed across the edge of the sink, while work shoes still left traces of factory dust near the back door. On the inner burner, the cast iron skillet was gradually heating. A glass jar of bacon grease stood nearby, with brown bits from previous meals still resting at the bottom. The 3 children had not yet entered the kitchen, but within minutes the smell of onions would bring them in before their mother's voice ever could. She opened the recipe box. An old grease stain had soaked through the blue floral paint along the edge of the box. The first card contained only the words, "Heat the skillet first." On the back was another pencil note, "Do not turn the meat too soon." Dish number 10 was a pork chop sandwich. About 43 cents made 1 large sandwich, and pork chops could be divided into 3 portions for about 78 cents. The mother lightly scored the fat around the edges before placing the meat onto the cast iron. A sizzle rose, the fat curled inward, but the spatula remained untouched beside the stove. Only when the pork chop released itself from the skillet did she turn it over. The father received the larger sandwich. The 2 children shared strips of pork laid diagonally across bread. The youngest child dragged a slice of bread through the remaining brown juices at the bottom of the skillet. That slice of bread passed directly through the place where the pork chop had rested. Dish number 9 was sausage with peppers and onions, about 52 cents for 3 servings. The sausage was cut into short pieces to create more brown surfaces and then transferred to an enamel plate. The onions fell into the hot fat. The sizzling softened as the slices began to cook down. Bell peppers were added last, followed by a spoonful of water that loosened the brown bits from the bottom of the skillet. The smell of onions moved through the hallway and drifted out onto the porch steps. The oldest child abandoned a game in the yard before anyone called for supper. Before the family saw the meal, they smelled it. Dish number 8 was minute steak with onion gravy. About 68 cents made 2 large portions. or 4 smaller portions when served with bread and mashed potatoes. The piece of meat was wider than a hand, but only slightly thicker than a coin. Mother dusted it with a thin coating of flour, browned it quickly, and lifted it out. Onions and water were added to the remaining drippings. A spoon drew the browned layer into a gravy just sufficient to cover 4 portions of potatoes. The father cleaned his plate with bread. The youngest child pushed the onions to the edge. The thin steak did not need to resemble a Sunday dinner. It only needed to fit onto enough plates. After supper, the skillet still sat on the stove, with a thin ring of gravy around the bottom. The recipe box remained open beside the pay envelope, while half an onion and a few bread pieces were left on the table. The mother allowed the cast iron to cool, while the children carried bowls to the sink. The plates returned nearly clean. Beneath one enamel plate, the final piece of sausage still waited for the following morning. The skillet the next morning and the meat divided into smaller portions reading Pennsylvania, 1956. The next morning, the cast iron skillet still rested on the rear burner, its surface holding a thin layer of fat from the previous evening's supper. Mother lifted the enamel plate, covering the remaining meat. There was not enough to place a separate portion before 5 people, but there was enough to go into a skillet of macaroni and a batch of corn fritters. One corner of the recipe card from the night before still protruded from the recipe box. She turned it over and added a short pencil note, "Save a little." The note was not about scarcity. It simply kept the ingredients from ending on the first plate served. Dish number 7 was cheeseburger macaroni skillet. About 74 cents was enough for 4 portions. Ground beef touched the hot skillet first, onions followed, and the edge of the wooden spoon continually broke the meat into small pieces. Cooked macaroni was added, then a little milk drew the cheese around each tube of pasta. The skillet was placed directly in the center of the table, its handle turned toward the mother. The oldest child brought a bowl first, but she still served the initial portions herself, reaching the spoon all the way to the bottom so the meat would not remain entirely in the first serving. Only after all 4 bowls contained food did she return the spoon to the skillet. She divided the first round. The skillet handled the rest. Dish number 6 was savory corn fritters with sausage. About 32 cents made 8 small fritters, including the remaining piece of sausage. Mother chopped the sausage until the pieces were no larger than kernels of corn, then scattered them across the batter before mixing. Spoonfuls of batter dropped into the skillet as rounds only slightly larger than a silver dollar. The edges browned, the centers puffed slightly, and the smell of sausage once again moved through the kitchen, even though very little meat remained. Each person took 1 fritter first. The last fritter was broken in half. 1 half was placed on a plate, and the other was wrapped in paper for a lunch pail. The final fritter rarely belonged to only one person. 5 dishes had passed across the same cast iron surface: pork chops, sausage, thin beef steak, ground beef, and the remaining sausage divided among 8 fritters. The mother wiped the skillet with brown paper, leaving behind a thin coating of fat, then returned the card to the recipe box. By the end of the 1950s, working-class kitchens were beginning to hear additional sounds: the hum of a blender, the seal of a refrigerator door closing, and the pop of a can of pineapple being opened. In Bangor, Maine, an old wooden table was about to receive dishes with new shapes and new appearances. The sound of the blender, a new refrigerator, and the cards near the Ballon of the Box, Bangor, Maine, 1958. The kitchen of a paper mill worker's family, the blender motor vibrated across the countertop and caused the glass pitcher to shift slightly. The wooden table, cast iron, skillet, and jar of grease remained exactly where they had always been, but the new refrigerator sealed more tightly than the one the woman's mother had once used. Inside were milk, cottage cheese, cream cheese, green olives, and a few slices of bacon. The mother pulled down the recipe box. The cards near the bottom carried newer handwriting: banana, coffee, milk, cheese and olives, breakfast for supper. Dish number 5 was banana coffee shake, about 21 cents for 1 large glass or 2 small glasses. The banana with brown spots was broken into 3 pieces. The milk went into the blender pitcher first, followed by the banana, sugar, and instant coffee. The father drank most of it after a night shift. The older child tasted it and then set the glass down. The next time, the mother blended the banana with the milk, poured out the child's portion first, and only then added the coffee. The card remained unchanged. Her hands remembered one more step. Dish number 4 was a cream cheese and olive sandwich, about 22 cents for 2 sandwiches. The olives left damp circles on the cutting board before being chopped finely and mixed into softened cream cheese. When guests visited or there was a church gathering, sandwiches were cut into 4 triangles. The crusts remained on a plate beside the stove to be eaten later with soup or peanut butter. She trimmed the crusts away for guests, but she did not throw the crusts away. Dish number 3 was cottage cheese with canned peaches, about 29 cents for 2 small plates. Half a peach slipped from the spoon and settled beside the white cottage cheese. The syrup was saved in a jar for the following morning's breakfast. After taking the children to school, washing clothes, and brushing paper dust from her husband's trouser legs, the mother sat down alone. It was only the sound of the kitchen clock and trucks passing outside. Some lunches were remembered because they were the first time the kitchen had become quiet. On the table, a thin streak of syrup remained on the plate. At the bottom of the recipe box were only 2 cards left: Friday night pancakes and corn, eggs, syrup. No explanation had been written down. The mother returned the blender to the corner of the counter, placed the can of peaches in the refrigerator, and let the kitchen gradually grow quieter. The final 2 dishes begin with flour, eggs, corn, a few slices of bacon, and a bottle of syrup nearly empty. Breakfast for supper, nearly amble syrup bottle, and the plate in the center of the table. Bangor, Maine, 1958. The blender had gone quiet. The can of peaches had been put away. In the kitchen of the paper mill worker's family, there was only the sound of a whisk touching the side of a bowl. Outside the window, it was already dark. On the table, the children noticed the nearly empty syrup bottle before they noticed the flour, eggs, and milk. The mother placed slices of bacon into the skillet. The fat dripped slowly, leaving a thin layer for the first batch of pancakes. The whisk was set down when the batter flowed from the ladle just enough. Small lumps remained. Dish number 2 was pancakes and bacon for dinner. About 61 cents was enough for a family of 4. The children asked whether it was someone's birthday. The mother said no. The father looked at the syrup bottle and said that tonight was an occasion all by itself. No one mentioned the price of roast meat or how much money remained for the week. Butter melted between the layers of pancakes, while the bacon was broken into smaller portions, so every plate would receive a piece. Years later, the children might not remember how thick the pay envelope had been that week. They would only remember eating breakfast after dark. Dish number 1 was corn fritters with maple syrup, about 28 cents for 8 small fritters. The corn was drained and mixed with flour, 1 egg, milk, and salt. The mother drew a spoon through the bottom of the bowl, adding flour when the trail closed too quickly, and adding milk when the mixture stood too stiffly. Spoonfuls of batter touched the hot fat, the edges spread thin, and then turned brown. The syrup bottle was placed in a bowl of warm water, and the remaining syrup was poured into a small pitcher in the center of the table. The youngest child chose the fritter with the crispiest edge. The father took 1 fritter and then rested his hand. The mother waited until every plate was filled before sitting down. After the first serving, 4 fritters remained. Each person took 1 more. The final fritter broke apart when it was turned, so the mother placed the 2 halves side by side on her own plate. At the bottom of the pitcher, only a streak of syrup remained. The child tilted the pitcher to look inside, while she looked at the clean plates and said, "Enough. Tonight it is enough." The final fritter had broken apart, but there was still enough for everyone at the table. The final 2 cards were returned to the recipe box. At the bottom of the box, beside an old coin, there was still a card that had been there from the very beginning. Written on the paper in pencil were only 2 words: 10 minutes. The 10 minutes card, the pot now cool, and a lid that would not close completely. Youngstown, Ohio, February of 1933. The enamel pot had cooled, but at the bottom there was still a dried streak of milk where the spoon had once passed through. Before the kitchen returned to that quiet state, small objects from 6 homes remained along the journey. 3 coins beside a coal bill, wax paper folded around a sandwich in a Detroit lunch pail, a small plate covering a bowl of potatoes in Pittsburgh, the ring of bread holding an egg in St. Louis, the thin layer of fat on the surface of a Reading cast iron skillet, and the nearly empty syrup pitcher in the center of a Bangor table. Crackers had once crumbled beneath a palm. Onions had once fallen into hot fat. A final portion of meat had once been divided among 8 small fritters. A broken corn fritter still rested on the plate beside those that remained whole. Those mothers did not use long names for what they knew. When meat still clung to cast iron, they said, "Leave it alone a little longer." The filling was running low. They said, "Do not put it all into the first sandwich." They measured flour with the palm of a hand, listened to the heat through the sound of fat, and removed the pot before the milk could boil over. Bread crusts were set aside on a separate plate because they still had a job to do later that afternoon. The back of a spoon touched a child's lips before the hot bowl was handed over to a child with a cough. 10 minutes was not always a short amount of time. In a kitchen that knew what to do, 10 minutes could become a supper. At the Youngstown table, the mother folded her cloth purse closed. 1 unused coin was placed into the recipe box beside the corner of a yellowed receipt. The bowl of rice, the milk, and the small handful of raisins had been enough to make 4 portions without buying anything else that evening. The children's shoes rested near the heater. The father's coat hung behind the door. She picked up the final card. Written on the front were the words, 10 minutes. Beneath them, in lighter pencil, were the words, "Use what is available." The card was placed at the bottom of the box. The lid lowered but did not close completely because receipts, scraps of paper, and old cards had filled the box. 1 corner of paper remained visible. If one of those dishes ever appeared in your family kitchen, leave the name of the dish and the way your family prepared it. Those small differences are the part of the recipe that never appeared on the card. Follow Old American Kitchen. Next time, the box will be opened again, the skillet will grow hot once more, and a chair will still be waiting beside the table. Those dishes were not cooked to become memories. They were placed on the table because someone had just come home from work, the child was hungry, and outside it was already dark. Some recipes were never fully written down because the kitchen taught the hands the rest.